Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Marco. In Africa has been discussing how to save the planet. The first Africa Climate Summit's just wrapped in Nairobi, Kenya, hosted by President William Ruto. There's been a heavy accent on how to find opportunities among the clear threats the modern world has made to our climate and our planet. Ruto stressed the word renewables. Here at France 24, Oliver Farry with this.
The curtain came down on the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi on Wednesday. The host, Kenyan President William Ruto, hailed a conference at which Africa, after much wrangling, managed to reach a consensus and a groundbreaking declaration on climate change.
Sale Walker Zewde, she's here. As a continent, we have developed our common position, which encapsulates our ambition for socio-economic transformation and our climate action agenda.
Ruto also said that Africa was vital to the global fight against climate change and a helping hand should be tended to the continent.
We demand a fair playing ground for our countries to access the investment needed to unlock the potential and translate it into opportunities. We further demand a just multilateral development finance architecture to liberate our economies from odious debt and onerous barriers to necessary financial resources.
There was disagreement among states about the direction to take. Some, such as South Africa and Ethiopia, have made strides towards boosting renewable energies. Others want to be able to continue to profit from their oil and gas resources. Speaking to France 24, the head of Nigeria's National Council on Climate Change said there's not a one-size-fits-all approach for the continent.
The investment that we'll be doing, the main thrust for South Africa, for instance, is to avoid and replace coal. Whereas for Nigeria, our main focus is to see that we phase out these diesel and petrol generators. So the investment pattern definitely has to be different.
The declaration will form the basis for African countries negotiating positions at November's COP28 summit in Dubai, a global forum where Africa has long complained it has not been given a fair deal.
We understand the summit will take place from now on every 2 years. Africa contributes then the least in terms of pollution and greenhouse gases, but inversely suffers the most for the mistakes and the indulgences of the so-called advanced societies. Now, of course, Africa has the right to develop and to have the goods and products its people would like. But can we all move forward together, perhaps, and create a future that will leave a planet for our children's children to live on safely and healthily? Our panel to discuss all the issues related to the Climate Summit and what happens next includes here in Paris, Sébastien Treyer, that's the General Director of the EDDRI, which is the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations, an independent policy research institute, a multi-stakeholder dialogue platform that identifies the conditions and purposes, tools to put sustainable development at the heart of international relations and public-private policies. I hope that sums up exactly what you do, sir.
Thank you very much, but that's
no
really
problem.
exact.
Well, you're here, and let's give you the full billing as we need it.
Thanks.
On the other side of the studio, someone who needs no introduction to regular viewers of France 24. Douglas Yates has been a guest here since the very first day, I think, of France 24. It's always a pleasure to see you, sir. An expert on Africa, as we know, a professor of political science at the American Graduate School, and it's always your great knowledge on Africa we call on when we need all matters discussed. We will be joined by guests from Africa who are being set up as we speak, so I'll introduce them when they are able to speak to us. So let's start here in the studio with Douglas and Sébastien. Gentlemen, your reaction to the fact this summit has actually happened and what you think has come from it. Can I start with you, Sébastien?
Yes, thanks a lot. I really want to stress that this is a success. Why do I say it's a success? Not so much because I agree with that all the text of the declaration is sufficient, ambitious enough, etc., but because what is really significant to me is the fact that African countries, African governments, and civil society, because they have been very present, are taking ownership and sovereignty over their own agenda and the agenda, the global agenda for vulnerable countries. And this is really important in the context where for years and for the last years, but even for decades, African countries have been saying, you say you listen to us, but you never listen to how we formulate the needs that we have. And to me, it was very important to see at the Paris summit in June, at the invitation by President Macron on a new financial pact between North and South, that President Ruto from Kenya said, well, thanks for having opened the agenda. Now I take the ball. It's my agenda. It's our agenda as Africans. And let me tell you how we formulate the same issues, but with our own needs. And that's the most significant to me.
So to take that image of taking the ball, Douglas, I mean, how do you see the game developing? Because clearly Ruto was talking about the fact that the developed nations who promised a lot a long time ago haven't quite delivered on that money-wise, and certainly not in reducing output of emissions. Africa perhaps in a position now to perhaps shape what goes forward. Do you see that as a strong possibility?
Certainly the political success, gathering a unanimous vote in a multilateral forum, is all to the credit of Ruto. To get that, he needed to have done the diplomatic work in advance. As for where the ball goes next, well, the biggest multilateral forum on the issue is going to be the same challenge magnified. And it's not clear that the diplomatic work has been done there. So what was the main fear? That this was going to be greenwashing, that societies like McKinsey were using this multilateral forum as a vehicle for selling carbon credits. And for viewers who don't know, carbon credits are a way in which polluters can pay for their pollution. And that money can be channeled into development projects or into green projects.
So that avoids polluting countries actually making changes. They're just
it doesn't stop pollution.
Fork out money. You know,
exactly. It's a way of buying your way out of pollution. And the big hosts this year are oil-producing countries. That is, countries that are whose entire economy is premised on carbon. On the other hand, the way that Ruto managed to kind of solve this Gordian knot of conflicting interests is he said, well, we can take that money and we can invest in solar energy. Or Komoro said, no, the blue economy. Okay, we can invest in tidal and wind and offshore wind. And Congo said, well, what about preserving the rainforest, which can absorb carbon? And Nigeria is very little on that, but maybe they'll try to reduce a little bit of their oil burning. But he was able to find a way that everyone could agree on the principle that that money, which was being accused of greenwashing, could be challenged into projects where Africa could make the energy transition. And I think that might have been behind this common Nairobi declaration.
Okay, Sebastian, quick word before we bring in our first guest from Nairobi.
I think this issue of carbon credits is a very contentious one. Yeah. I wanted to add to the criticism about that it's an excuse for polluters not to make the effort trying to use Africa as a sink for carbon. I also believe that the amount of money that we can get out of it is too small. I mean, when you look at what the Emirates have been proposing, I think they propose 400 millions in carbon credits, but 4 billion in terms of investment in renewable energy. What is needed is more in the billion size than in the 100 million size. And so these carbon credits, they also divert the attention from what matters. What matters is how to unlock the investment in sustainable development and sustainable energy in Africa for the industrialization of Africa. And the amount there is not so much about carbon credits. That can be a complement at some time in a project that lacks funding. But the main issue is the cost of capital for African countries. The interest rates are 14 to 20% in African countries for renewable energy, a renewable energy project, while they are 3% in the West. And that's the big issue, not the carbon credits.
Indeed, the Industrial Revolution started in northern England, where I come from, in 1790. And ever since then, we've been contributing to the pollution of the world and creating what we have today. So it's all our fault. Maybe we should be taking more effort and making more effort to make things change and not just pay carbon credits, but actually sort of make some genuine change. Gentlemen, stay with us. Let's bring in our first guest from Nairobi, Augustin B. Njamnishi, who's co-founder and chair of political and technical affairs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Augustin, thank you for being with us. Welcome to France 24 Debate. I hope you can hear us. I don't know whether you've heard what's been said so far, but what I'd like to ask you to do first is to give us your sense of what the summit means, how the summit went on, what you think will happen next. Of course, you were there, obviously listening to what was happening.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think there are two principal things that I would like to talk about the summit. First of all, I agree with Sebastian that just the fact that African leaders could come together to discuss one thing, which is climate change, is very significant. For the last 3 decades, we have not had this, an all-African summit focused on climate change. So we had more than 22 heads of states and governments here. It shows, however, that Africa is taking climate change very seriously. And of course, they have no choice because the impacts of climate change are devastating on the continent more than ever before. The second thing is the fact that we have tried our best at this first initiative, which is this first African Summit on Climate Change, to bring all the voices of the continent together. We from the Pan-African Climate Justice, leading the Non-State Actors Committee, started work since the month of March 2023, just to contribute to this summit. And we did wide range consultations and many workshops and conferences just to contribute. However, the influence of some lobbies and strong forces cannot be ignored. We understand the pressure under which the host government and even our own other governments were under, and we coming out with a declaration that is not totally, reflecting the aspirations of Africans is something we cannot put it to the back burner because this is a start. And we think for the next summits that will come in 2 years, Africa will take charge, full charge, and roll it the way we want. Because this is a summit that was intended for Africans in Africa and by Africans. However, we've had some advantages here that we can come together and talk about climate change and climate change alone.
Augustine, it's good to get things out in the open, and it sounds like very much that has been the case. All the issues have been set out in front of everybody, and you're starting to think about things in a serious way going forward. Augustine, bear with me, please. I'll get some comments from the gentleman here in the studio. We've got Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School, expert in African politics and other African issues, of course. Sebastian Treyer from the IDDRI, the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. Sustainability, gentlemen. This is the key, isn't it, surely, going forward? Sebastian.
No, what I also wanted to put on the table, and I think what Augustine has said is extremely important, that we need to continue the work, that the declaration is not perfect. What I wanted also to put on the plate, on the agenda, is that the next step is not only COP28 on climate. The next step is also the annual meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in Marrakesh, first time in Africa, in October. Because a lot of what President Ruto and the colleagues from Africa, the governments, also civil society have been putting on the table is that it's actually the sustainability or the viability of development that is at stake. How will Africa be able to access investments for its own industrializations? Because there are so many needs of jobs and incomes for a growing population that this is the main issue. And it's being challenged by climate change. But we can't have a separate discussion on development and on climate. It's all interconnected. And so the next steps are both COP28 and the annual meetings. And in that context, I think this summit was extremely important and goes beyond the climate discussion and sustainability being understood as something that is just about the environment. It's really sustainability as the aspiration. I mean, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're about prosperity, industrialization, and the environment. And that's really at stake for Africa. That's also how we need to think of the next steps.
Augustine was talking there about the special interests, let's put it that way, people trying to sort of put together a certain agenda. I think you were hinting at perhaps some countries that produce a lot of petrol, that burn a lot of petrol. These kind of moves may not be in their interests.
Right. The pollution problem, which is effectively carbon emissions in the atmosphere. There are other things, but largely we can say the main problem are carbon emissions, is an integral part of big business, and particularly things like the oil industry, energy industry, the military energy complex in some of these countries, and some of the very powerful regimes, influential actors in the Middle East and on the global scene. And those actors are not interested in changing the use of oil and in some cases of coal or gas. And so they're agents provocateurs. They're spoilers. This is a multilateral convention. And the danger for multilateral conferences are spoilers can come in. And so what they would like to do is in the negotiations introduce what is seen as a compromise solution. We won't stop producing oil and gas. We won't fundamentally change the global warming that will happen because of that. But what we will do is we'll start to provide funding for investment in disaster relief, in alternative energies. We'll start to working sort of applying band-aids to the problem. But ultimately what we need to do is go on a low carbon diet. And this is not on the agenda.
Let's bring in Augustine again for another comment on that issue. Augustine Njamishi, who is from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, joining us from Nairobi. Augustine, you were at the summit. You listened to what everybody had to say. You had your say too, I can well imagine. Do you have a sense among the people that you've spoken to that there can be this kind of international cooperation within the continent to bring about the changes that are required?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, the fact that these African heads of states and governments came together to Nairobi to discuss climate change is already significant. It's a good sign that Africa can at least talk amongst themselves. We just wish that for next time, the lobbies that were around to push their own agenda should give us the space for Africans to talk amongst themselves. Of course, we're not excluding anybody because we need everyone, to put hands on deck to support climate action in this continent. Let me take this opportunity to say one thing. There has been this talk about Africa victimizing itself, that we should not talk about how Africa is, the highest bearer of climate impacts. Meanwhile, they have contributed the least. And our answer is we're not playing victim. We're not playing victim because, one, we are victims, so we're not playing victim. Somebody that plays victim is the person that wants sympathy for something. But Africa is not looking for sympathy. Africa is only asking for its rights because we have to solve the climate crisis. For instance, for a meeting that is of this magnitude, we would have thought that adaptation, loss and damage will be the principal, priority, the first on the agenda, because what Africa needs for this moment is to build resilience and do adaptation in order to survive. All the communities are going through a lot of difficulties, floods. A continent that is flooding and burning at the same time cannot miss an opportunity to let the rest of the world understand. And when we are talking about these things, it's not a matter that we are begging. It's just that Africa has to be treated with respect and fairness and equity because we did not cause this problem and it is urgent. Again, that said, we think Africans, this is just a summit. The action that will be taking place in all the other summits or meetings of the African policymakers will be very critical because the African Common Position has been there since Copenhagen 2009, and we only are improving on it based on science and equity and fairness. We hope our heads of states and governments will take this seriously. And just how they do it within their own countries is very important. Africa is already spending a lot of money on adaptation. A TFON report that was published in July this year or last year says that many sub-Saharan African countries are spending 5 times the budget for adaptation than they're spending for healthcare. It means Africa is dying to adapt. This should have been taken into consideration and highlighted in this summit. But anyway, this is a step in the right direction, and we hope it will be followed by action.
There are so many things you're saying there, Augustine, which really we need to examine. It's phenomenal stuff. And what you said about a continent that's burning and flooded at the same time, there's a lot of, obviously, noise being made here in Europe about those same issues and in North America as well. And I'm reminded of the words of Graça Machel just before the start of the summit, one of the elders, the former, obviously, the widow of the great Nelson Mandela. She said, well, what took you so long to wake up to these facts? We've been dealing with this for many, many generations, so big problems there. Let me, before I let everybody loose again, just turn to this issue of renewables. There could be opportunities for the greener future, like renewable energy. Our report next will show how this is already being used in some parts of Nairobi to keep perishable food fresh for market. They're powering fridges by a renewable way.
Once harvested, the days are numbered for these watermelons and avocados. In the sweltering tropical heat of this Nairobi market, bins of spoiled food go hand in hand with the mounds of fresh melons. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization says between 30 and 40% of horticultural produce in sub-Saharan Africa spoils before it even gets to market.
The major causes of post-harvest loss is how the produce is managed immediately after harvest.
Cold storage units like this one can help mitigate losses by keeping perishables cool, which also lowers the chance that farmers be exploited by brokers.
Brokers say that they're coming to harvest, but they delay, spoiling our oranges.
Founded 4 years ago, a company called Soko Fresh, which means market fresh in Swahili, has capitalized on this need for cold storage. It sells space in solar-powered mobile units. Serving some 12,000 farmers, it also buys perishables for larger distributors. With a spotty electrical grid in many remote farming regions, the fact that the cold storage units are solar-powered is both cost-effective and reliable.
Solar energy is one of the free sources of energy that could reduce our operational costs. So we opted to use solar, which enables us to deploy anywhere.
Kenya derives 93% of its electricity from renewables, like solar energy. Using the blazing sun to its advantage, the company, which was set up in partnership with multiple NGOs and the World Food Programme, has now expanded to help fish farmers keep their catch nice and cold.
Solange Rujan with that report. Kenya then already making progress on that issue of renewables. Before we talk more about that and about adaptation finance, because that line from you, Augustine, was phenomenal about actually spending more on adaptation finance than healthcare, so dying to adapt. It's a remarkable phrase. Sebastian, you had a word to add as Augustine was speaking.
No, I was really struck by what Augustine was answering your question on victimization of Africa. I think what is really striking, what makes a difference, and I understand Graça Machel was impatient, but now what is changing is that the world is considering Africa it's not just the moral argument that is important. It's not just that Africa is a victim and a weak victim, it's that Africa has power. Because lots of the Western and Asian powers are looking for alliances that are stable, that can bring votes to the UN, that can bring opening new markets. Africa is an emerging market that matters. And it's also lots of resources, so stable supply of resources is very important. So that gives a lot of power. And the last thing that I think is also beyond the only issue that there is, Africa is a victim, and that is important in moral terms. That would not give a lot of power. It's also the consideration that African countries' debt problem is actually a problem for world financial stability. That's quite new, and that makes the current situation of Ghana and Zambia resemble a little bit more Greece and the EU. For the moment, the Ghanaian Minister of Finance is saying, my debt situation is even worse than everything. My guarantees are better than Greece had, and you saved Greece, why don't you save me? I believe this notion that the debt problem in African countries is a world problem is now spreading, and that's, I think, what also gives a lot of power to the issues that are raised at this summit.
Is this part of a kind of mindset that the established order has regarding Africa? This idea that, yes, you can bail out Greece, but you can't bail out Zambia. What do you think, Doc?
Well, yeah, I mean, the problems of Africa are part of global problems. And so economic problems in Africa are part of the global economic system. And what we've seen with the pumping out of trillions of US dollars is a lot of credit was available. And as well, with China making its entry into the African continent, it lent a lot of money to African regimes without really making good investments. Although it's important to build infrastructure, not if you can't, if that infrastructure can't finance itself. And so, yeah, bailing out Greece was necessary for European stability. But Zambia? Why would rich countries bail out Zambia? So we talk about debt relief. It's possible to make political gestures, but fundamentally, the accumulated debt of Africa is not going to receive debt relief. There's going to be things on the margin, and the political will's not there.
I know. I can sense by the way you're saying this. It hurts you to say those words, but they're not your words. It's the way the system is. And
I would disagree on that. Just to say that I agree that for economists in Europe, the collapse of the Zambian economy is not considered a problem. But I think it's an intrication between political and economic issues that make Zambia count. And in Paris, there was a deal made to bail out Zambia. So there is something strong enough in political terms to make that change that is not macroeconomically significant. And I think the intrication between macroeconomics and political issues makes Africa count much more than we thought before.
Indeed. The potential is massive, obviously. The potential is massive in Africa. We all know that. But changing from fossil fuels to renewables, I did some research. We're talking not billions, but trillions of dollars required for that. Let's bring in Augustin again from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Just reminding people who maybe are just joining us, Augustin and Jamishi is at the African Climate Summit in Nairobi and co-founder and chair of political and technical affairs at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. You said earlier that people are dying to transition, and that was what you were talking about, sort of adapting and changing, countries spending more on that than they spend on healthcare. Anybody hearing the words that you said earlier will think that can't be correct, but it's happening. So is it just a question of getting more money from donors? Is that what's required, sir? Tell us your view on it.
I think it's a question of donors or northern countries, developed countries, paying what they're supposed to pay for climate action on the continent. We cannot take a country that is already in debt and is suffering from the impacts of climate change, looking for scarce resources to adapt to climate change, while those who have caused the problem are still sitting there and saying, we cannot escape this rhetoric. It is a fact. What we talked about, renewable energy. Yes, it is true. Africa has renewable energy potential. It will have massive endowment of solar, hydro, and wind, and whatsoever. These things are not resources until you have used technology to make them energy. And who has that technology? It is not Africa, right? So it doesn't make sense if we only put these resources together or this endowment as an argument to say Africa must transition immediately. It has to transition immediately, of course, but with support from the developed countries.
Do you feel, Augustin, that, sorry to cut across you, do you feel, Augustin, that the rich developed world, let's put it that way, do you feel that they've been patronizing towards Africa in that sense? I'm thinking of the 2009 pledge to give something like $100 billion a year to help climate adjustment, to help resolve the problems that we're living through now. Do you think basically the rich nations have been not looking at Africa in a serious way, just basically paying lip service?
I would say they are paying lip service. Let's take these facts, these figures. Between 2019 and 2020, CPI figures say there was $632 billion in climate finance. Out of the $632 billion, only $46 billion was for adaptation, and then $15 billion was for dual purposes. It means mitigation has taken the better chunk of the money. Now, the priority of Africa is adaptation, but nobody is talking about this. And again, I will come to this summit. In Sharm el-Sheikh, article or paragraph 34 of the Sharm el-Sheikh Plan of Implementation is very clear. It says climate finance in vulnerable regions, especially sub-Saharan Africa, are better in grants. We thought that in a summit like this would be expatiated upon and let developed countries say how they will provide grants for this, because adaptation remains a priority of the continent. Article 9 of the Paris Agreement is very clear. Climate finance is that finance that moves from developed countries into developing countries for climate action, which means adaptation and or mitigation. And it goes further to say this finance should be predictable and meet the priorities of the regions. The African priority, first of all, is adaptation and building resilience. We're not seeing a lot of this. So when we hear these announcements, what we call in the Pan-African climate justice, feel-good announcements. We've had a lot of announcements since Copenhagen up to today. At the end of the day, you don't see where the money is coming from or where it is even going to.
Augustine, I need to stop you there and bring in our other guests to give us a kind of insight on that one. But this concept of the feel-good announcement, I think people are really resonating on what you're just saying there, that it is something that is said and it's not backed up with the hard sort of help and money and contributions that people need, know-how, technique, technology exchange, those kind of things. Augustine, bear with us, please. I'll bring you back in as soon as I can. Douglas, this issue is really, I think I'm getting a sense from Augustine that he and fellow Africans feel they've been sort of basically not hung out to dry, but kind of left to kind of just basically tread water rather than being helped to actually sort of really get to grips with what's going on.
Right. Well, like you had said, the climate problems in Africa are related to the development problems. So there was an IMF report that was released just a little bit before this summit, which explained that Africa's fragile states are going to be the greatest casualties of climate change. When you have a country where rainfall agriculture is your principal source of revenue, things like drought or floods destroy your economy. And it's the poor, the rural poor, who suffer the most. They're unlikely to receive a dime of this money that's going to be invested in solar energy and wind power. That money is going to go to African businessmen and middlemen and state rulers, but not to the African poor. When they have flooding and crises caused by climate change, these states don't have the resources to actually respond. So people die, people starve. In the fragile states where you have conflict, this money is not going to go to conflict regions. No one's going to build a wind farm in northern Mali. So a lot of this money, the reason it's a workable solution is a lot of this money is going to go to the same places where the money's already going. But for many Africans, they're not going to see a dime of it. And that makes them bitter. And then that makes them perhaps falsely accuse this of not being a solution. It's part of the solution. The energy transition in Africa is part of the solution, but Africa contributes very little to the carbon footprint of the world. So building solar energy in Africa is wonderful. That story of helping them in Kenya, that's great on the micro level. But on the macro level, it's not African consumption that's contributing to global warming. It's the destruction of the rainforests, and it's the production of things like oil. Nigeria flaring its gas. At night, when you look at a satellite image, you see Europe lit up from electricity, and you see Nigeria lit up from gas flaring. 1 million barrels of oil equivalent a day being flared into the air.
That is a scary figure, Douglas. 1 million barrels a day just burnt like that. Absolutely crazy. I'm thinking of people I've met in Botswana. I've been there a couple of times for France 24, who are trying to create, via the internet and via web technology and the tech sector, create a relaunch for the country in a different way, looking at a different solution going forward, a different way of doing things. That's what Africa needs, isn't it? That kind of invention, that kind of drive in that sense. And dumelang to everybody in Botswana, by the way, who I know will be watching.
No, I think I just wanted to say that what I like in the affirmation of, particularly by the Kenyan players, that renewable energy is the solution. It's not because it's decarbonized, it's because for rural areas, you have these types of solutions that we saw that can be extremely well developed without being connected to the grid, and that makes them easier to develop, and that can enable to have the cold chain in rural areas and thus triggering a little bit more of added value capture locally than has. So there is a lot of potential. I'm not saying that in conflict areas this is going to solve anything. I'm just saying that there is a smart idea behind that when it's really developed with the innovation potential of those who know the field and how it is going to be developed. The second thing that I'm really in favor of that because I think for rural areas in particular there is a lot of potential. My second point is to really concur with Augustine that for adaptation you need grants and not loans. And that's a lot of money that we need to discuss about how much can we add to the existing capital of the grant part of the World Bank, the IDA, not the IBRD, sorry for the acronyms, I will not develop them, but the grant part, not the loan part of the World Bank. And that needs a lot of money there. And I don't see a lot of Western countries saying, I'm going to put more money there. And that's a key question. Yeah. That's why also William Ruto, the Kenya president, is saying, we need to look at the international fiscal regime and find taxation money to get more public money for those grants.
A carbon tax.
Yes.
We're getting that message loud and clear in spite of the acronyms. Don't you worry about that at all, Sebastian. Extremely clear. Let's bring in Augustine once again from Nairobi. Augustine Njamashi, who is from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Augustine, your contributions so far have been really, really provocative and great. I hope you were able to listen to what the guys here were saying in the studio. In terms of the call that President Ruto made in order to change the way banking is done, world banking is done with Africa. Do you see that as something that is essential for the next steps going forward to help Africa begin to unleash its potential, but also make the changes necessary to create that greener future?
Absolutely. I think the call from President Ruto is very, very important. You know, you can't fix a problem with the same mindset that created it. For us to succeed and to solve the climate crisis, there's a need for an overhaul of the way business is being done, especially by the institutions like the World Bank. So we think that call is very loud and clear. But the question is, will that bring any change? Is it possible? And I think if the international community has the goodwill to change things, they will do it. I will want to give an example of something that has happened in the past few years. Climate crisis has been there. It is not something that is new. It's only increasing in speed and in the wideness of the damage. But we know that on this continent, many people are dying from climate impact related activities. When COVID came a few years ago, in the few months that came by, we could see that the world mobilized a lot of money, and a vaccine was discovered in record time. And we are now dealing already. COVID may soon become something of the past. If we had that goodwill, as far as climate change is concerned, we'll not be talking about climate change the way we are talking now. For 27 good years, we've negotiated. In fact, those of us who have been in this for this number of years, we keep being asked the question, why do you always go to those negotiations and come back empty-handed? Does it mean that the international community does not understand that climate change is already devastating Africa? The woman on the farm in Cameroon, the pastoralists in Kenya, they need to see something. And I'm happy with one of the speakers who said how the money gets to.
Augustine Njamashi there from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance cut off in the middle of a great point he was about to make there. And let's bring in our guests here in the studio, Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School and Sebastian Treyer from the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. Augustine, they're talking about how people go to summits, come back empty-handed. That's the kind of perception that has to change, isn't it, I think, because it's a question now, and I think it's something he was getting towards, the point he was getting towards making. This is Africa's moment to really sort of take the bull by the horns and really shape what happens next. Sebastian, would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I'm not very optimistic about COP28 being the right framework for being less empty-handed, because what is going to be discussed there are how do we go beyond the 100 billion that were promised, while we actually need not billions but trillions. And that's why I was putting the emphasis on the fact that we need to also look at the World Bank and IMF reform, because this is another part of the equation. Not very optimistic there either that we find a solution by October in Marrakesh, but I believe there is a lot of attention to be done, that the mere fact that we have a lot of money for Greece or for COVID in Western countries, US but also even China and Europe, we need to do the same for Africa, for the debt problem in Africa. And this is something that needs to change. I hope a little bit more of the global context about this new financial pact between North and South than the COP28 on climate specifically.
Indeed. Sorry, Augustine made the point about COVID's effect on Africa. And Douglas, the issue there as well, you could talk about COVID's effect on Africa, the Ukraine war effect on Africa too. It seems whatever happens, Africa is the one that seems to pay the price.
Right. The lower level of development means that they pay higher rates for interest. It means that their costs of basic goods suffer more for inflation. Africans spend more on their food budget than do other regions of the world. When food prices increase, Africans pay more. Although they're great producers of raw materials, all those raw materials are processed in the developed world and sold back to them. So they tend to not actually benefit from raw materials because they don't process them. Everything seems to accumulate to these problems. But where this process, the Nairobi Declaration, could make a contribution is if they could concentrate their attention, they could get a carbon tax. And that would be something right now only 24 countries implement any kind of carbon tax. It's very unpopular among consumers. So in democracies, people don't want to see their price at the pump more. It's extremely unpopular on oil exporting nations because it lowers consumption of their principal goods. But a carbon tax is a fair way to distribute the costs and perhaps then provide a resource for African development to advance and make the energy transition.
It is something that everybody individually could make happen, or do you sort of listen to what John Kerry says, the US presidential envoy on climate change, who was at the summit? He said that it's not something that governments can change. It needs more than that. It needs private sector involvement. It needs all those issues.
Passing it on to consumers at the pump is not going to work. But passing it on to the global oil corporations who are making record profits at this time is very feasible.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. And President Ruto, in a former version of the declaration, the Kenyan presidency of this summit has proposed also a tax on financial transactions. So there are lots of ideas where we could really get at grips with what Ruto was calling a very unfair financial system globally.
Sebastian Traer, Director General of the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you to Douglas Yates, Professor of Political Science at the American Graduate School. As always, thank you, sir, for being with us. Thank you to our guest from Nairobi, Augustine Mdimishi from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Augustine, we lost you in the middle of your last answer. I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't come back to you, but thank you for your contribution. It was much appreciated. We didn't get our fourth guest, sadly, from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Amat Pate Sene. But we hope we provided you with a good discussion about what happened at the summit and what happens next for Africa and for the world. Stay with us here. This is France 24, more news to come.